On the left, we have our particle resolved composition. This isn't the full set of particles. This is a schematic, but it's representative of what our population looks like, where we have sort of an external mixture here of those black particles sort of at the bottom, and then these red and orange particles are made of something else. And so then what we do is we say, well, let's assume that the model's getting the size right perfectly, but we're just going to assume an average composition. And so we do different sort of averages to sort of mimic the kind of averaging we would do in our different models. But today I'm just going to talk about the panel B there, which is making an average over the population. So basically we're taking our particle resolved composition and we're turning it into a fully internal mixture and seeing how big of a difference this makes. And so what we find here is that it depends on what we're trying to predict, how well this model, how well we do with that approximation. So if we're concerned about CCN concentrations, and we start with a population that's a fully external mixture, we have some fresh combustion particles that are really hydrophobic that were emitted into some pre-existing background aerosol that's something more hygroscopic. Well, right at time zero, when the simulation starts and they're this fully external mixture, we see that we get a difference between our particle resolved simulation and our fully mixed particles. But we see that after aging, these differences don't seem to be quite so important. So I'll explain just briefly why that's happening. So bear with me for a second. This is kind of a complicated figure, but I think it's a really nice illustration of what this model can do for us. So here I've gone through and I've picked out just the combustion particles in a different scenario. And so this is just showing how our model represents these aging processes. So at the start of the simulation, we would have these very hydrophobic combustion particles that are really different than the background particles, which would exist sort of in the upper right corner of this space. And so what's shown here is a bivariate distribution with respect to dry diameter and the hygroscopicity parameter. And what's nice about this is these are the variables that we need to compute the critical supersaturation. So if the particles cross from left to right, one of those lines, that means they go from CCN inactive to CCN active at that supersaturation threshold. So you can see at the start of the simulation, this is 10 minutes after the simulation started, we just emitted some combustion particles. They're really hydrophobic. They're going to be really different from everything else that's in there. But then over time, they evolve very quickly. You can see in the bottom left-hand corner, those are particles that are growing by condensation. In the upper right-hand corner, those are particles that coagulated with the pre-existing background. And they're modified very quickly in this polluted environment, which is meant to sort of represent something like Los Angeles. It's an idealized simulation, but basically what happens is after not very much time, the particles become so coated with the hygroscopic stuff that it doesn't matter that they started out as hydrophobic. You can assume a fully internal mixture and it doesn't really produce much of a problem. Scattering, we find that there's not a big impact of this external versus internal mixing approximation. That's no surprise. We don't have a big difference between the real part of the refractive indices and the species that we're simulating here. But then absorption, we actually find that there's a big difference between the particle resolved and the fully mixed particles, regardless of the extent of aging. And so we're focusing on aerosol cloud interactions today, but just briefly, what happens is that black carbon's absorption depends on how much it's coated. If you have a coated black carbon particle, it absorbs more strongly than if the black carbon and the other stuff is in separate particles. And so basically what's happening is when you do this composition averaging, you artificially shift the coating onto the particles that contain the most black carbon and therefore are the most absorbing. And so this has been a persistent problem in our models and has caused a lot of confusion in our closure studies for a long time. And it seems like this compositional diversity is really, really important for capturing this process. So when we're talking about things like unresolved properties, the best solution I can come up with is to use something like machine learning or a statistical approach to train a surrogate model that can approximate the impact of these processes while using just the information that the models already track. And so we actually applied this to the GISS model, and we found that it made a really big difference in absorption enhancement when you do this. So under problem one, some of the models are not tracking some of this information. We don't expect them to perform well in mixing state. They weren't designed to do this, right? However, these models were designed to capture the evolution of the aerosol size distribution. So let's see how they do when we're just simulating the evolution of the size distribution, oh my gosh, which is what they were designed to do. And so what we're doing here is we just basically run side-by-side comparisons, run the same scenario with part MC as you would with a reduced model such as something like MAM4. And so what we've done is we did this by comparing part MC with MAM4. And so it's shown here, we run 100 scenarios. We always run PPEs with part MC. We just haven't been calling them this for many years. But what you can see here is the rows here are just five examples picked from this PPE of 100 scenarios. And if you go from left to right, this is the initial conditions on the left, after 30 minutes and then after 60 minutes. And what you can see is that MAM4 quickly diverges in its representation of the size distribution in comparison with part MC. On the very bottom row, you see the model does pretty well, but that's because nothing's really happening, right? Like if there's very slow aging and the particles start staying just as they were in their initial conditions, then the model does really well because nothing happens. But if you want to simulate the evolution of the size distribution, it seems like maybe we need to think about something, think about changing the structure of this model. And so then, of course, these changes in the size distribution correspond to differences in CCN activity. And in general, we saw across this PPE that the more aging we have, the greater the divergence. So I'm going to quickly get to the end here where what we're really trying to do now is expand this effort. We're trying to build this community effort to develop a standardized approach for benchmarking these aerosol schemes and modifications to these schemes before they're implemented in large-scale models. So the process here is you have to pull the scheme out of the large-scale model. We're learning that there already are all of these box models. We are going to work with the community to develop a standard suite of verification tests. Geez, please. And then a standard set of metrics for evaluating accuracy and efficiency. And so right now we've been in the process of sort of gathering information, building the infrastructure. We've learned that benchmarking means very different things to different people, and so we're going to start with just something very simple, sulfuric acid condensation. All of the models have it. We don't have to unify the chemistry. And so the idea here is that we're hoping to bring these models together in a virtual workshop, do this sort of intercomparison, and then during this workshop also make decisions about where we go next. Do we want to focus on SOA, internal morphology, what have you? And so we have been trying to gather information from the community. Please, oh please, do fill out this survey. It's only 2 minutes. If you're a modeler, if you're using a model, if there is a box model, please tell us. Please tell us which processes you want to prioritize. You may have already seen this before. We've been trying to promote this for a little while now, but yeah, please. And then of course, when we are designing this workshop, we will be distributing to many lists, but if you complete the survey, you'll certainly be in the loop. So thank you so much, and I'd like to thank DOE and PNNL for the funding.
Thanks so much, Laura. Next, we have Kaitlyn Loftus from Columbia University on the death of autoconversion.
Hi, everyone. I'd like to thank the organizers for giving me the opportunity to speak. My name is Kate Loftus, and I'm a postdoc at Columbia. And this is work that's benefited from a number of collaborators and also advisors, Marcus Van Leerwalke, Hugh Morrison, and also Robin Wordsworth. And today I want to pose a question about, is it finally time to kill autoconversion? First, I just want to give some motivation about cloud drop collisional growth, which of course autoconversion is trying to parameterize. This is a process that's very important for the Earth's water cycle and energy budget. It's initiating warm rain, it's helping to regulate warm cloud precipitation efficiency, and it's shaping cloud and radiative precipitation processes. And I think all of these were raised as key discussion points during the warm phase microphysics breakout session on day 1. And then one thing we've known for a long time is that if we compare our global climate models to CloudSat using instrument simulators, we see that they overestimate drop collisional growth relative to what CloudSat predicts. And I think McKenna Stanford has done some really exciting work recently, maybe casting some doubt on what this actually means for surface precipitation rates, but I think undoubtedly we can say that this mismatch between the observations and the models is showing us that we're doing something wrong about collisional growth. And these are just warm marine clouds for reference. So these are 1 to 2 degree models, so kind of CMIP class. And here we are looking at a 14-kilometer model, which we still see has the same problems, suggesting this might have something to do with the microphysics rather than the macrophysics. And also these differences between these two PDFs are just coming from the same model, and we're just switching the autoconversion schemes. And so kind of in the face of these consistent biases, we decided to take a look at what CMIP6 models are actually doing to parameterize collisional growth. So here's a table that I'm sure none of you will be able to read, but you can see it in my thesis if you're interested, or talk to me later. And basically what we find is, even though on the surface there seems to be a lot of structural diversity, and I think people often cite the CMIP experiments as perturbations of structural, something that can help us capture structural uncertainty. What we actually find when we look at a little bit of a higher level is that these parameterizations share fundamental structural assumptions, and I'm going to go through 3 of them here today that are kind of relevant to this autoconversion question. So the first assumption is that condensed liquid water is divided into 2 categories, loosely based on drop size. So we have a small category of cloud drops and a bigger category of raindrops. And when we make this assumption, we basically turn this collisional growth problem from a kind of diversity of size range of drops interacting with each other into a 4-component. I won't say processes, because I've heard a number of people critique that these are actually processes, but components. So what I want to focus on today is autoconversion, which is the movement of drops from this kind of small category into the large category. And I just want to kind of revisit the physics of why this is actually a problem, which I think has kind of been maybe sometimes lost when we just talk about autoconversion all the time instead of actually going back to what's physically happening. So rather than talking about autoconversion and accretion, we can think of 2 kind of types of collisional growth. First is kind of early collisional growth, when drops, especially the larger drop involved in a collision, is less than 40 to 60 microns in diameter. This process is highly nonlinear, and we can see that by how the average drop mass rate of change with time is scaling. What happens is we can see lucky drops can run away from the smaller drop mode, and this growth is really sensitive to very small changes in the drop size distribution, which we are not capturing in our simplified parameterizations, and the probability of collision is extremely sensitive to both drops involved in the collision. In contrast, if we look at later collisional growth, so when our larger drops involved are kind of above around 50 microns, we have approximately linear growth. We're not really super sensitive to small changes in the drop size distribution, and this kind of is, I think, the theoretical underpinning for why we often have accretion parameterizations that agree really well with each other, and autoconversion goes all over the place. So kind of going back now that we've talked about what autoconversion is into these CMIP6 shared assumptions, the next one is that autoconversion is the only process that can create raindrops in warm clouds. And so obviously this is really important when we think about precipitation initiation as something shaping not only the water cycle, but playing a big role in cloud lifetime and cloud radiative effects. And I think we also heard yesterday about how autoconversion can mess up lots of things in mixed phase clouds too, though that's not the focus of today. And the final assumption I want to mention is that autoconversion rate is a function in these models of cloud category variables. And so in the models that have 2 moments, this would be mass and number concentration. In some of the models, it's just mass concentration. And a key implication of this dependence on only mass and number is a problem that was pointed out almost 50 years ago by Cotton, 1972. And I think there's been many other critiques that are kind of tied to this issue, phrased in different ways. But the main critique is that if we're only representing like 2 basic properties about the cloud drop size distribution, we can't represent this process of cloud aging. And what this kind of means is that there's always some period of time before a cloud is going to be able to produce precipitation-sized particles. And if we don't have the capacity to represent small changes in the cloud drop size distribution, we can't represent this cloud aging process. And if one of the conclusions of those three assumptions that I mentioned is that 50 plus years later, this critique is still applicable to our cutting edge CMIP6 models. And just to kind of give a more schematic representation of this cloud aging process, so basically what is happening in a physical cloud is we can have an extended period of time before these cloud drops are interacting with each other and getting big enough to move into a raindrop category or maybe into a more linear mode of collisional growth. And basically what the CMIP models are saying is that we can neglect this cloud aging process. And so what I think is an important question to ask is if this aging process is slow relative to drop lifetime against evaporation, this will have really big implications for whether or not warm clouds are going to generate precipitation. And so what I want to ask is, are these shared CMIP assumptions about autoconversion an important and missing structural error in climate models? And so in order to kind of think about how we should move forward with this, I think every scientist in this room can probably get up and say why their process is the reason why we have climate uncertainty. We want to test some assumptions before we do the really difficult work of putting something into a CMIP class global model. And so here I just want to talk about two different types of case studies that we did to look at these autoconversion assumptions that I think kind of tie back into some of the talks that we heard yesterday. So first, we want to use in situ observations. And second, we want to use process model, specifically LES or large eddy simulations in this kind of calibrated physics ensemble framework. So first, in order to answer this question of is this neglected aging regime important, we want to test this with observations. So we use in situ drop size distribution observations from the holodeck instrument, which is able to, like the PDI that Patrick showed yesterday, coherently with one instrument measure a full range of drop sizes spanning this kind of transition size range. And we look at these in situ DSDs in warm marine boundary clouds, boundary layer clouds, sorry, from two field campaigns in the North Atlantic and East Pacific, ACE-ENA and CSET. And maybe going back to what Graham Feingold talked about the other day, we are facing the question of how to assess the activity of this aging scheme with only snapshots of cloud microphysical state. And we've done a few different experiments to look at this, but I want to present something that I think is quite simple in the interest of time. And so if we recall back to what's actually happened in collisional growth, we can remember that drops that are above around 40 to 60 microns have exited this highly nonlinear collisional growth regime. So what we say here is that cloudy air samples that have more than one drop in this, above this size threshold are not consistent with being in this aging regime. And so I just have a schematic here of a bunch of small particles that are going to be consistent, and if we have a single or more large drop, we're going to be categorized as inconsistent with the aging regime that the CMIP models are neglecting. And so what we find is that we have obviously sensitivity to what kind of sample cloud volume we look at, which we have to trade off against distance. Here I'm showing a range of sample cloud volumes that kind of span where we see from the statistics of the going out to larger volumes that we have the presence of these drops, these larger drops. And so what we can see is that we have uncertainty in what fraction of our samples are consistent with the aging regime, depending exactly how we average the drop size distributions. But it's pretty clear that we're looking at something around 50% of samples. And I think that really suggests that neglecting this aging regime is not justified. And so I'll briefly just discuss some other work looking at attributing structural error to autoconversion. via this kind of CPE or PPE framework in LES. And we're using LES because then we can have control of the cloud macro physics, which is not possible, obviously, in a global model without significant expense. And what we do is constrain a CMIP-like bulk microphysics scheme in LES based on a more complex bin microphysics scheme, specifically the tau bin microphysics scheme, using machine learning-enabled Bayesian inference, or basically a similar workflow to what Greg and Ken discussed yesterday. And by CMIP-like bulk microphysics scheme, I just mean we have similar process rate forms. And because of how we traditionally translate cloud microphysics schemes across scales, really the main difference is we don't have any kinds of subgrid variability in here because we're running at higher resolutions, but we have a very standard power law autoconversion formula. We have 2-moment, 2-category bulk scheme, and we're specifically looking at parameters associated with collision coalescence and sedimentation. And I'll just highlight this as part of the BOSS framework being developed by Hugh Morrison, Marcus Van Leeuwenhoek, Sean Santos, and others. And so here we use as constraining observations very simple mean and state properties. So just mean liquid water path and surface rain rate from a bunch of different LES simulations run with the tau bin microphysics of different stratocumulus cases where we perturbed the environmental conditions of background aerosol and initial water and temperature profiles. And I'll skip applying the constraint, but basically once we have our constraint parameters, we can look at the implication for processes, which is what we're really interested in. And what we see is that process rates for the constrained bulk scheme largely agree with the bin rates. Note that we're not characterizing evaporation, which might change that picture a bit. But so we see agreement in the process rates from our bulk scheme, except for autoconversion, which I'm showing here. You can see very good agreement on the left of the accretion rate, whereas the autoconversion rate is showing large biases. We can also, because we have the context of time evolution in the LES, we can look at PDFs of autoconversion rates and where they're coming from. And what we see is that the constrained autoconversion PDF is kind of straddling 2 modes of autoconversion rates that are coming from the bin scheme. The smaller mode is in this aging regime, and this larger mode is kind of coming after the aging regime, suggesting we're having to compromise on these autoconversion rates. I'll just skip this in the interest of time, but basically autoconversion repeatedly emerges as a source of structural error in these experiments where we can constrain parametric error. Looking towards the future, there's many strategies that are out there to improve the early stages of parametrized collisional growth, and many people in this room are working on them. And I think something that is really important to include is this aging process. And so with that, I'll just leave my summary slide up and ask everyone to contemplate if it's time to kill the flawed but resilient autoconversion paradigm. Thank you.
Stay up here for, thank you, Kate. If the other speakers could return to the stage now, we'll have open discussion now until break at 10. So when we've got all our speakers at the stage here, I think we can go ahead and start. Marcus?
Yeah, this is a question for Andrew. With something like the neural network framework, how do we integrate, or is there a way to integrate satellite observations into maybe refining some of those things?
I'm sure there is. We'd have to think it through.
Okay, next question. I think I saw Johannes rush up a second. Yeah, we'll come back, but you rushed up, so and then we'll go with Graham.
Right. So much to say. I'll try to keep it brief and connected to the themes of the week. So it's really nice to see. I mean, the thing that's been hounding me about the autoconversion framework is that on the one hand, from subgrid arguments, you say you need an enhancement factor that's greater than 1, but then from satellite observations, I say you need a factor that's less than 1. And I think it's a perfect example, and also what you're doing with the emulation of trying to resolve one of these structural problems that are standing in the way of applying observational constraints to the models because the models have a structural problem. But then on the other hand, of course, you have the issue of the parameterization just needs to be good enough to do what we're asking it to do, and there's a hidden cost to adding more complexity, right? So I was going to ask, are you planning to address that in the CPE? But of course you are. I guess I'll still ask Andrew that. But so for Kaitlyn, my question is, more pre-ramble. One of the nice things about having an initiation process as a separate process in the model is that I think we have an observational constraint on that, because when it rains in the satellite, we know that precipitation initiated, right? So I'm wondering what your take is on this trade-off between, do we have an actual observational constraint that's targeted to the parameterization that you're proposing?
Yeah, maybe I'll answer your first question about adding more structural complexity. I think I kind of had to skip over my slide, but I think one point to recognize is we don't necessarily need to add more structural complexity to address this problem. I think there's two options that don't kind of involve adding more prognostic variables in. Either we can change what the prognostic variables are, so I know Hugh Morrison is actively working on this in E3SM and as well as Arthur Hu and some others, but we also can try to leverage stochasticity is something that a lot of other parameterizations like radiation already use and have used for many years to kind of capture the fact that we're not resolving key inputs into these processes. And in terms of the process-based constraints from satellites, I think we just need to use everything. And so I'm really excited to try to use more ground radar observations that maybe can see the surface better, like some of the stuff McKenna Stanford was doing. But yeah, I mean, I hope that we can leverage those CloudSat observations and move them closer to agree with the model.
Okay, thanks. Yeah, I think it'll be nice to see whether it actually shrinks the uncertainty.
So I did find a microphone as well that I can pass around. So if there are people who want to speak but aren't able to easily get to the microphone, raise your hand and I'll keep an eye out for you.
Graham, and then Jiwen.
Yes, so I very much enjoyed all the talks this morning. I'll start with a comment to Andrew, but I think it's very much a general comment. There is in this micro to macro thinking a strong focus on microphysics, and I'm all for that. That's my world. I do think about other related aspects like advection. When you start looking at drop size distributions on a 1 degree box or a half a degree box, even frankly on a 100-meter box, you start to broaden your distributions, and that has nothing to do with microphysics. How do you think about advection along with, numerical diffusion on a physical grid and numerical diffusion in a mass grid when you start thinking about comparing DSDs in your model to observations?
I think of it more in terms of subgrid variability, right? You're talking about advection and from one place to another, and you talk about the thing about a drop size distribution is there are drops, and then as you get more and more drops, you make a distribution. So it's a function of what your integrating scale is. And my concept is we just have to integrate. I mean, I guess if you're defining it and you're defining process rates based on it, you want to actually have it relevant to the process rate scale. But, you could think about this also in terms of just single drop interactions, which is what you do in like a super droplet model. And so I think there's a range of things. I'm not so worried about broadening of size distributions because I think the concept itself has an averaging scale inherent in it. And if we're using sort of bin type approaches, then we're still doing the individual droplet. I mean, I think it's important, and it gets back to what Kate was talking about, because you have drops of different sizes. And to some extent, the distributions I showed are not broad enough relative to the average observations. So,
Yeah, but I think we do have this fundamental problem of advection being, you know, it's part and parcel of the microphysics. One can't separate it. You could do it in a box. You can get your perfect microphysics in a box. Once you put it on these large grids, you're starting to spread things out, and it makes it more difficult to identify processes.
yeah, I don't worry about spreading things out. I worry about mixing things that are different, which is the subgrid variability. So you have a little box here in an updraft, and you have a box next to it in a downdraft, and those have different size distributions and different processes. But when I average over them, I can't resolve that. So it's more figuring out, to me, it's more figuring out the subgrid part. And you are, you know, you can think about advection from one box to another, but I'm more worried about just the differences between the boxes and the smearing that occurs. I mean, I think we're saying the same thing, but it's just a different way.
Okay. I won't hog the microphone. I had some comments to Kaitlyn. I loved that talk, so, but we can talk afterwards.
Okay, yeah. Thanks. Jimmy Fan from Oregon National Laboratory. So this is more about CLIVAR physics, so Andrew and Kaitlyn. So I probably said this in different occasions that CLIVAR model, you know, fundamentally the way the physics is done is not physical, because you know, we have the large scale condensation through saturation adjustment first, and then calculate droplet number based on parameterization of activation. Well, you know, physically we should calculate the droplet activation based on supersaturation aerosol first, and then do the condensation based on the droplet, size distribution and supersaturation. So from there, I feel it's already not physical. And then, you know, below zero temperature, 0 degrees Celsius, we have to partition between liquid and ice. Also, because we don't have a supersaturation, the Benjamin Van Dyson processes cannot be physically calculated. So that is, you know, from large-scale bulk estimates, it is already caused such a large uncertainty there. So that's come to my comments about what we should ask from the CLIVAR model. It's not meant for process level understanding. We add more and more complex physics in there. To me, I think the approach Laura, you know, advocate with machine learning to emulate those complexity and estimate first of all, I think we should estimate what processes are really important, and then what is the stochastics custody there. So then add those to the CLIVAR model to basically we only need statistics, right? For CLIVAR model, that's actually the important thing to us for the CLIVAR projection. That is the way I would more like advocate in this community, because process level understanding, that's high resolution with beam approach and super droplet approach, those really can provide us some good data sets right now for the machine learning approach to get this, at least the uncertainties of those detailed processes. So that is basically my general comments for us, like the climate community. You know, thanks.
Okay, thank you, Jiwen. We have 4 more folks here who have questions. Yeah, please do, Andrew.
Thanks, Jiwen, for the comment. I think you gave a really nice overview. I'm going to push back on something. I don't think we should say it's not physical. It may not be perfect, but it is a representation. And you said we make assumptions, we do it statistically, we bring it up to what's important at the climate scale. But I would argue it is broadly physical. It may not be perfect. There may be better ways to do it. And I agree we need to focus on key processes. And I think what you saw up here, and particularly from Kate's talk, is we know where some of those key processes are, and that's where we need to really try to dive down. And what Laura was talking about, where we make corrections to the ways that we do things and to get at making sure we're not making the wrong assumptions. But I wouldn't say it's not physical. I think that's dangerous because I think it is broadly physical. It's just it may not be perfect.
I want to quickly ask Donovan if you have a comment on the supersaturation calculation. We haven't heard too much about dynamics.
Well, in a perfect microphysical scheme, you will treat things like you do it for ice, right? That you create the ice and the ice starts growing. And then, that way you don't have to have two separate condensation, a separate large-scale condensation scheme and a separate microphysics scheme. But that for warm clouds is very hard to do because of the time scales involved. And yeah, I mean, on the other hand, it's very hard for models outside of the microphysics, for climate models, to deal with supersaturation. So if we put supersaturation explicitly in a climate model, like for example, we try to do it for ice, the dynamics starts to complain, and the turbulence starts to complain. Another thing that they are based mostly on saturation adjustment scheme. So to make it short, yeah, I agree with that comment that we need to have something that is consistent across scales. And that has been really an issue for the last probably 20 years, that we are developing separate parameterizations for supersaturation, microphysics, dynamics, turbulence, and I think some of that has come up as an issue in this workshop.
Thank you. Matt?
Yeah, Matt Lebsock, JPL. First off, thanks to all the speakers for great talks. I really enjoyed all of them. I'll limit myself to one question for Andrew. Andrew, you showed that beautiful plot showing the negative correlation between ACI and shortwave cloud feedback. Importantly, showing that we can't separate these two problems, right? They're really coupled problems. And I believe if I followed you correctly, you kind of used one constraint in your PPE. You used like the shortwave reflection had to be within 5 watts per meter squared. So thinking forward towards a future CPE where you might include other constraints, what sorts of constraints from observations would you find useful to sort of further constrain that ACI versus the shortwave cloud feedback? I have some of my own favorites, but I'd love to hear what you have to say.
I mean, Greg Elsasser has done this with, a whole bunch of constraints, but he's been using global values. So I think it's really tricky to use the global because if you looked at the plot, the constraint points basically span a good chunk of the range of ACI and cloud feedback. And I'm not sure that the emergent constraint paradigm of, we just add a bunch of constraints and we'll get one set of parameters or one structural approach to the models that's going to get us an answer. I don't think that's the way it's going to go. So I think the reason I chose to not add a whole lot of constraints is I didn't think that was going to be a productive way forward. Also because I found the unconstrained and the constrained were giving me similar broad scale relationships. There wasn't a difference in processes that jumped out or parameters that jumped out when I put constraints on it. So I don't think the emergent constraint concept that we think we're going to solve forcing and feedback by just applying the right emergent constraints from the present day is going to actually work. I think some of the issues with sensitivity we saw earlier in the week and susceptibility or across different scales are sort of evidence of that.
Okay. Interesting. We should continue that discussion and maybe distinguish between CPE constraints and emergent constraints a little, potentially. I don't know. Yes.
Yeah. Hi, I'm Li Hui, a PhD student from University of Illinois. I also do some large idea simulation with microphysics. So I'm very impressed by the Laura's doing the chemical composition and evolution of multiple aerosols and also Kaitlyn's scheme to do the auto-conversion stuff. From my understanding, the current approach, no matter the beam microphysics or the super droplet, both of them it seems to me that aerosol properties and the cloud droplet properties are kind of separated. So when doing microphysics, what I'm receiving is mostly some class basic properties like the hydroscopicity, etc., from the aerosol. But I was thinking in this process, aerosol and cloud drop, they have the similar dimensions. I was wondering, is that possible to dynamically update the aerosol properties and also cloud properties in the scheme, including the scavenging and also the coagulation of aerosols, etc.?
We're trying to do that right now at PNNL, and I'd be happy to work with you and talk about it further. I think typically, like in an LES scheme, you don't want to carry around all those aerosol tracers. It just makes the model more expensive, and it's not typically what the cloud folks care about. But as an aerosol scientist who wants to understand what's happening to the aerosol particles during cloud's processing, we've been trying to mess around with this, where we sort of interface something with PartMC with a super droplet method to explore some of those things. So always happy to collaborate if you want to talk further.
Okay, I think we're going to take, it's 9:59. We're going to take one more question.
Thanks. I enjoyed the talk on structural deficiency for all conversion. So in addition to the aging problem you are talking about, there are two additional structural deficiency in current 1 and 2 moment schemes we are using. One is the neglect of spectral shape of droplet size distribution, which there are a lot of people talk about. Another one, probably less studied, less talked about, is the threshold process that evolved with the autoconversion process. For example, we use just a single power law of fitting a relationship cannot represent the threshold process. I'm just wondering what your thought on that.
Yeah, I totally agree, and I've really enjoyed your work on some of the drop size distribution with questions. I think, yeah, I don't quite know, I wonder if we can subsume some of the questions about the drop aging into the distribution with. Originally, I had both as separate points. I guess from the perspective of like, what is the condensation and variability of the supersaturation doing to drive that? But yeah, I agree, it's a super important issue, both for the growth processes and for the radiative effects. And the threshold, yeah, I agree.
Thanks so much for a great session. Thanks to our speakers and great questions. And we are moving on to a break now and returning at 10:30 for a final discussion and next steps.
Just before, one quick thing, before everyone goes to the break, I have one slide. Can we get that up? Awesome. Thank you so much. So I am currently in my second 2-year term on the ARM User Executive Committee. And I, in the first term, chaired, and in the second term, co-chaired, together with Erica Rosler and Yunyan Zhang, a subgroup of the committee that was focusing on helping provide recommendations to ARM and collect community input to help ARM address the charge that they've been given to improve their integration and communication with the modeling community, especially for global climate models. And where ARM has historically, or at least in recent years, been not quite as well integrated as with LES and process level modeling. And that's particularly been the case, I think, related to aerosol and ACI. The integration has not been as strong as, for example, with boundary layer turbulence. So we put together a survey of the community. Some of you will have seen this already, but I would like to invite anyone who is interested to please take a few minutes. It should take less than 10 minutes to fill out this survey. You could do it right now during the break, and help to provide your input. And we will be summarizing the input from the community at the next, and presenting on it at the next ARM-ASR PI meeting. Yeah, thanks. I see lots of people getting the QR code. And while I have the mic and I'm talking about this, I want to also remind, for those folks who are in the ARM community and have received a ballot, right now is the time to vote for the next representatives of the ARM user community on the UEC. I will be rotating off, as well as some of my other colleagues who are currently on the UEC. Those ballots are due November 8th, and quite a few of the candidates are here in the room, so I encourage you to take a look and make sure that you turn in your vote. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Susanna.
Howdy, all. So this is our summary and next steps portion of the workshop. So we're going to try to give you our first impressions of gleaned from this workshop and talk about what happens after this. So we have some slides. Oh, fantastic. So this is just pulling from the website. This is the original proposal that we delivered to US CLIVAR, and the workshop itself is intended to, we've run into the problem where we potentially are doing a framework of frameworks, so we've tried to make all the slides consistent, but the idea is to develop a set of new frameworks to confront and evaluate climate models using observations to improve our process-based understanding and strategically reduce climate projection uncertainty at decadal timescales. So I've highlighted those words. And within this, we have 4 specific frameworks that address different components of this problem. These are looking at climate model improvement, understanding uncertainty and remote sensing. So when we have observations where we can't really get up next to the thing we're trying to measure because of the way microphysics works, it's a little difficult to observe remotely. Machine learning as a way to deal with some of the parameterization issues that we're having, as well as potentially remote sensing. And finally, leveraging what we know now to plan impactful in situ lab measurements.
So I suggested that we should add forwards to the original statement to say at decadal timescales. And the reason I have suggested this is that I think it helps us to constrain which set of processes and problems we are really focused on in a way that is meaningful for human relevant climate impacts that climate models are particularly well positioned to address. The 2 reasons I think this, and I hope I can convince you to think this too, are that first, at short time scales, we get into a regime where we're dominated by initial condition uncertainty. It's kind of a modes of variability problem. And that is not where climate sensitivity uncertainty or the related issues of climate physics matter the most. And at longer timescales, it doesn't matter anymore how good your climate model is. What matters is what humans have done over the coming 50 years. So there's this area in the middle, and this was kind of shown nicely schematically in this paper by Lehner et al., where they attempted to quantify how much internal variability, scenario uncertainty, and model uncertainty contribute at different timescales, kind of showing that there's kind of a maybe 20 to 50-year timescale where climate model uncertainty is particularly important. And those timescales, and this may be a somewhat DOE-centric view that could be probably broadened, but those timescales are also really critical for people who are making decisions, not necessarily intergovernment agencies that require coordination of 180 governments to take action, but like local governments, state governments, energy utilities, federal agencies who are making infrastructure investments right now, and they need to know that the things they are planning now will be resilient to the climate that we will experience 50 years from now. And to do that, what they need from us is better information about what that future climate is likely to look like and what the uncertainties are, including uncertainties in extremes. And so that's my quick explanation why I think we should really be trying to constrain our focus, especially to things that are relevant at decadal timescales. And that's where I think climate sensitivity and everything we're talking about this week is really critical.
Yeah, great. Thanks, Susanna. So I'm just going to zip through these. Climate model improvement is this 3-way street between in situ, remote sensing, and model development. So figuring out ways to facilitate this to be optimal and robust, understanding how we can use things like what Andrew showed this morning with using machine learning to make parts of the model just perform better and, again, provide more robust and useful predictions. Understanding how the uncertainties in our remote sensing play into our observed uncertainties. And so, things like this Nakajima-King retrieval at sort of the simplest level, but broadly across remote sensing. And then finally, the idea that how we plan future field campaigns and lab work, as well as identifying places where we can get a lot more out of previous campaigns, as being shown here in Litai's recent paper.
Yeah, so the next chunk of these slides are going to be trying to summarize what we think was covered in this workshop. And there's some people who are really, really good at standing up and going to a mic, and there's some people who are really good at typing. And so for those of you who want to leave comment but not say it out loud, please scan the QR code, and there will be 3 questions through Slido. The first one asking for feedbacks on takeaway, second question asking for feedbacks on how we make progress, and the third one will be on do you have any other comments. And so this is a great way for you to give us comments if we missed something from one of the sessions or a big picture topic. Here's where you can leave it without saying anything. And oh, I should say, you're in Slido, you can upvote other people's comments. And I've also, this might be crazy, allowed downvoting of people's comments. And also, you can leave feedback anonymously, but it would be helpful if you did log in with your name. So we can, as we're synthesizing the report, we could put some thoughts on, this came from this person and.
Yep, I guess we allow downvotes, so this is not a consensus process, but the idea is to represent opinions from the community. So we've tried to encapsulate some of the things that we're capturing from this workshop that go into the eventual white paper we've been tasked with delivering. This may not be a complete representation of everything that has been discussed, but we thought these were kind of the things that could fit in a single slide and maybe get some preliminary responses from everyone here before you leave. So we had a lot of discussion about PPEs and CPEs across a variety of scales, and how a lot of the ability to do these is sort of enhanced by ML techniques. We discussed the potential applications of the benefits rather of operationalizing PPEs as a stage in model development. And there's a lot of discussion over the fact that PPEs are a well-posed problem to look at parametric uncertainty, but the way that you look at structural uncertainty is complex, right? And so multi-model PPE intercomparisons are one way to try to get some traction on that in a way that requires, relatively little configuration beyond just comparing a couple of different model structures. And a final comment within the model uncertainty quantification reduction component of these notes is that we need to find a way to balance the complexity, robustness, and climate uncertainty reduction. So, the idea that we can look at all these extremely complex, small-scale processes happening in the atmosphere, but we need to understand how we put those into the models that we need for decadal scale prediction in a way that is robust and gives us a reasonable and reasonable envelope of what the future is going to look like. Within, observations are an important part of this model development framework, and so one of the key things that we came out of this is that at the end of the day, we really care about the observational systematic error, and that's really, really hard to estimate. And so one relatively straightforward recommendation is simply measurement intercomparison for similar things, sort of like what Greg was showing in his talk. As we go forward, we may need some additional observations to improve our models in the sense of not necessarily their fidelity, but their projection uncertainty. And so one thing that was identified by several participants is the need for hypothesis-driven pre-campaign simulations, in NASA speak, I guess, OSSIs. And one adjunct of that is the need to assess what we are going to need from instrumentation on those campaigns as a component of that. Like, what are the development needs for future instrumentation that are tuned to our climate projection uncertainty? So it's not just developing one really good instrument if it doesn't tell us anything about the climate projection. And so this is a way that that three-way street can work. The need for continued long-term systematic measurements was discussed, and again, campaigns that are targeted towards persistent model uncertainty. So using the models to inform where we're going to do those campaigns. Again, within the sort of three-way street concept of model development, communication between model and measurement community and joint projects, as well as structures where different agencies that might have more apropos sets of observations to evaluate a particular problem are leveraged across this suite of models, as well as international partners. So those are our key takeaways. Susanna put together this really nice flow chart that maybe she can walk us through briefly, that sort of outlines how those takeaways could be formed into this three-way street.
Yeah, so we thought it would be helpful to have some kind of a schematic diagram to communicate what the overall workflow is that we would envision in the future state when we've achieved everything that we've identified as a priority this week. So I think that, Anne and Johannes and I sat down over lunch yesterday and sketched some things out, and this is kind of the straw man that we came up with. But please add your comments on the Slido, tell us, poke holes in it, tell us what we missed. But I'll go through it now to explain what we are thinking. And this framework, we tried to write it in a way that's sufficiently general that it applies both for the climate Aussie kind of thinking and also for the field campaign design thinking. So the idea is you could start probably anywhere in this diagram. Usually we've done some prior work that has led us to identify a hypothesis about a mechanism or process that is either missing or is incorrect in our current understanding of the physics as encapsulated in a model. And that could be any type of model, LES, GCM, a simulator of an experiment, like a cloud chamber simulator, for example, a box model, and probably ideally with some instrument simulators included in it so that we represent the measurements in the correct way, or something closer to the correct way. So we have some hypothesis, and then based on that hypothesis, we do a study with model simulations to look at different alternative designs of whatever experiment we plan to propose. So a design of a measurement network, a design of a satellite mission, a design of a field campaign, to look at what instruments do we really need, which variables do we need to observe in order to get information that will help us to constrain the uncertainty in that model through the PPE framework. And that's this observing this, for those who don't know this acronym, by the way, it's OSSI is Observing Systems Simulation Experiment. This is kind of a NASA keyword. Oh, I don't know if okay, sure. Okay, so that's where we are. It's a model study for experiment design. And then you could maybe go one of two ways, or you maybe even do both at the same time. One way is you go back to the lab or to theory, or you do maybe data analysis of existing experiments, and you work on the kind of fundamental understanding level and then try to translate that into a parameterization you can put back into your model. The other direction is then you go to the field or to observations of the natural environment and use those to test your hypothesis. So you could do either or both of these. And then after you've done that, you do a follow-up model study where you evaluate how well your model performed and whether your hypothesis was supported about what the needed improvement to the model process representation is. And then based on that evaluation and on the new observations you have, you then recalibrate your model or you update it with missing or revised process representations. And then you quantify how much having done this whole process has reduced your uncertainty compared to what it was in advance of the experiment. After this, you're still going to have biases, so hopefully you've reduced some biases or reduced some uncertainty, which is, by the way, not the same thing as we've discussed this week. And then you repeat, you go back to the beginning and you identify of the remaining problems in my model, what are now the highest priorities we think in terms of model biases and uncertainties, and generate hypotheses about what might be causing them. So this is kind of the general framework we thought could kind of apply in both cases. And I think there are examples where people are doing this, but this piece in particular, I think has been hard to do, often in part because, as Ken noted at the very first day, very first session, the funding models often don't support it. So the funding, especially I know like for field campaigns, we often cannot get funded to do any modeling work related to a field campaign until after the campaign has already happened, which makes it impossible to do this step, or almost impossible. And then both in this step and in this step, we could, as a community, be more systematic in the way that we incorporate multiple sources of observations into a framework that can be gradually added to and improved over time to constrain uncertainty observationally, so that we are not just looking at one process in isolation, but looking at it in the context of what we already know about the other processes and their constraints. So that's what the diagram is intended to convey.
So just a straw man. These things are all going to be evolved on, but I think it's a really good roadmap for how we kind of deal with the fact that we have this intractable problem of dealing with the effects of small-scale stuff on large-scale stuff like climate. One of the things we want to discuss is maybe a recommendation that was going to come out of this is that there's this need for interagency working groups, and put forward a couple. One is reducing uncertainty in future climate projections, and this would be building this framework that specifically looks at how we project future climate with models, with representation across modeling centers, which gives you the structural component of the uncertainty that we need. A second interagency working group would be quantifying uncertainties in climate observations. One of the things that came out of this is the key, the importance of not just having a good observation, but understanding what the systematic uncertainty is in that observed variable. The hope here is that, each of the agencies kind of have a portfolio that includes modeling and observation, that across these agencies there's a lot of sort of low-hanging fruit and model improvement and climate projection and uncertainty reduction that can be pretty easily picked. So the timeliness of this is pretty good over the last decade or so. Being able to develop a lot of tools that allow us to tackle the uncertainty from essentially parameterized processes. And as we move to higher resolution models, fewer processes have to be parameterized, sort of this kind of squeezing down of uncertainty and quantifying phase. Of course, the urgency I don't think we need to really go too much into, but I think we're all on the same page there. The charge for us as the climate science community is to be able to provide these relevant, timely predictions that are aware of this microphysical uncertainty that drives a lot of the climate projection uncertainty. Very mechanistically, our next steps here is that the SOC gather and write up this white paper, hopefully encapsulating the talks and posters and discussion breakout at this workshop. It's a quick workshop, right? It's 2.5 days to deal with all future climate and projection uncertainty. So we're having this report out now to capture any last thoughts you have from this meeting right now where everything is really fresh. We obviously are not going to just ignore your emails after this. So I'd ask that if you do have specific comments or things that you would like to potentially convey from this workshop that didn't get conveyed right now, please reach out to one of us, preferably the SOC member that's sort of most directly related to your comment, and we'll try to incorporate that feedback as it is possible. Present this white paper to program managers, so your white paper does go somewhere. And our sort of longer term goal is to convert it into a BAMS article that is part of the peer-reviewed literature and can sit there. So both these things will have DOIs, but the hope is that the ideas from this workshop do end up existing beyond this workshop. I'll leave the thank you slides for now. Do we want to just open it up to any last comments? What do we think? Oh yeah, I think we have time. If Mike, you want to say a few words on the, yeah.
Hi everyone, Mike Patterson, Director of the US CLIVAR program. Want to thank the organizing committee for the work in preparing the agenda for this meeting and the execution of it over the last several days. This distilled set of the schematic that you put together, I think, is really going to be instrumental, not only for this community, but for others. This wiring diagram of how we connect the pieces will be really, it'll be good information to provide agency managers so that they can see how investments in field campaign modeling activities, as well as what I'll talk about here in just a second, climate process teams. There's different mechanisms and different parts of your wiring diagram there where investments can really enable the community to actively participate collectively and to focus on priorities and then make progress in model development, connecting back to the observations and process understanding that's gained through process studies. So with that, if you can put Suzanne's
Sorry, I got it.
diagram back up. So this top box, I think, if I understand it correctly, I mean, maybe it's overarching, but there is an interagency approach that has been implemented initially in 2003 through a joint call between NOAA and NSF to address modeling studies for evaluating models and then developing new parameterizations that draw in the understanding from recent new observational data sets and field campaign measurements, working with theoreticians as well and model developers at the modeling centers to evaluate the model performance with regard to specific processes and develop in collaboration with the community the improvement of the development of new parameterizations, testing those, evaluating them, and implementing those in, say, CAM and the GFDL atmospheric model. There's a long history of this. There's been 3 rounds of proposals for climate process teams supported by NOAA and NSF principally. All 3 rounds have included awards for cloud and at least a recent one on cloud and aerosols. The most recent ones focusing on boundary layer momentum and I guess it's the EDMF, is that right? That'll give us a unified parameterization from shallow to deep convection. Both of those have been supported again by NOAA and NSF, focusing on improvements in both the GFDL and NCAR models. There's an opportunity downstream. Right now, our process study model improvement panel is developing its own white paper that will inform agency decisions on proceeding with the next round of CPTs. The current proposals, or projects rather, they're in their 5th year. They will, all of them have gotten a 1-year extension, so we're trying to inform agency decisions now in time for a call later next year or the following year. It sometimes takes a couple of years for them to ingest all the information and make their decisions on how they're going to approach putting out a call. No guarantee. I'm not here to represent any agency, but I can say we're working with them to put forward a future call. And I think the discussions this week and some of the prioritization approaches for which processes are really key could help inform multi-PI efforts and the development of a next round of, putting forward proposals for the next round of CPTs. So I was probably longer than you wanted, but I think it's important that everybody understands that what's happened here you can plug into a process that US CLIVAR has in place. So.
And Mike, I wonder if you can just say briefly, like how large are those teams usually, and what would someone need? What would what does it take to put together a successful proposal?
Yeah, so in part, those who have participated in them, are there any in the room that have, can perhaps speak? And can answer that a little more. I haven't been on the writing end of these or the evaluation end. But I would say that the size of the projects, roughly $1 million or so a year, maybe more. Right, and there's this, in some ways, an in-kind support by the modeling centers. Although there is funding specifically provided to, say, a postdoc position at the modeling centers to help do this work. And then typically there are I don't know, PIs that across maybe 5 to 6 different institutions. They're 5-year projects. There's a 3-year kind of check-in to make sure progress is being made on track before the final 2 years are agreed upon. Yeah, and so the development of that is all done by a group of PIs working together collectively to put forward the proposal. This next round, the agencies really want to emphasize, and maybe some of this discussion can help inform what the US CLIVAR panel tells them, but they want to emphasize the priority processes that address the persistent model biases, right? And I think that's always been the case, but they want to make sure that they're putting the money into, they're investing in those projects that will have the biggest return on reducing the biases that exist. And I don't know that we go back at the very end and really check that with these projects yet. Maybe that's something
That's
we
one
should
of the
be
steps
doing.
in the diagram, is to
Yeah.
go back at the end and check it. There's another point I'd like to ask you about, but maybe if people have quick responses on that, on the climate process teams.
So Graham and I were involved in a climate process team, which is actually what led to higher order closure first being put into a GCM, 2 GCMs actually. I was a little shocked that only 2 of us raised our hands. Oh, okay. So yeah, Rob. So there's a couple more, but to me, I think this is actually sort of the opportunity that we need to think about. The fact that very few people raise their hand means it hasn't been done for cloud physics. And when we write this white paper, I think it needs to argue that. What I was sort of saying in my talk is I think, because I'd be very interested if somebody has done a post-mortem on all the CPTs, because some have been successful, some haven't, some have achieved what they wanted. Why? And I do think there's a lot of stuff in this workshop about how to do it better. A lot of it's up on that diagram, but I'm just saying that what Mike's talking about should probably be the way we focus the white paper, and this community is going to have to be a little careful in trying to argue with one voice. And we don't have one voice, we have lots of voices, but just the perfect is not the enemy of, make sure the perfect is not the enemy of the good when we're communicating at this level, which is what my message would be.
Well, and I will point out that in the last round, there were 5 awards. 2 were related to the topics that have been discussed here in terms of boundary layer momentum. I know that's not necessarily the microphysics, but it's, you know, it's important to the convection.
I was just going to say that one of the other things that came out of that CPT, and it's a bit disparate because from what you were doing with it, was that the Grosvenor, you know, the droplet concentration, we really nailed in, got down into that and looked at where the biases were in that, and then out of that came that product, right? A lot of people are using droplet concentration. I'd say we've sort of done a persuasion job and just got better at assessing uncertainties in those retrievals, right? So I think that's another thing that came out of it, which, you know, the observations is another key component.
Yeah, the interesting thing is the way the process team was phrased, because traditionally they were focused around an actual process rather than a science topic. And if we have cloud physics and a couple of things we've discussed here, it's actually a little broader than a typical process team. So we have to be a little careful about how we define it. And so if the model problem is an emergent property, then it's not just one thing, and that's the tricky part. If the real problem with the models is we can't constrain aerosol forcing or cloud feedback, we're not working on one process probably. So that's a slightly different, it's an interesting challenge for the organizing committee to figure out how we would fit that into a white paper that might make it apropos.
Yeah, and of course the white paper is not going to be a proposal for a project, but maybe could help to set the stage or identify what kinds of, like that there is a need for climate process team efforts or similar kinds of efforts that focus on processes relevant to future climate projection uncertainty. Mike,
I just want to respond to that. I think that's a really critical point where we've talked about, even our write-up on the website, I was just checking it, we say process. We don't say plural. And I think we should be maybe thinking a little more broadly. So that can be some, that we can, I can bring that directly back to, we're developing this white paper right now, or this piece right now that will go to the agencies with I'm the next person to review it. So I can inject this point that perhaps we need to think more expansively.
Okay, yeah, Ken Carslaw from Leeds. I think what you're proposing transcends climate process teams. It's the integration of them to reduce uncertainty that's required. It's quite a different task. Developing more fidelity for models, as well motivated as it might be each time, has not delivered in terms of reduced uncertainty, clearly, or we wouldn't be here. So I think you need something that links climate process teams. It's something different. I think you need to think a little bit outside the box, and as hard as that might be. I think what you wrote up there in terms of interagency discussions, and I think you should flesh out something that looks a bit different from what you already have, because this is an integrated problem. And as I've said before, we actually know how to do this. I think there will be some devil in the details, but as a community, we know how to do this pretty well. I can see the difficulties of lining it up, but I think you should try to do something that links CPTs, something that's longer term, that CPTs come and go, can feed into, that always have to deliver to a program of reducing uncertainty. That will not be any one CPT, I think. And just the final point, I understand this is US CLIVAR, but it would be nice to acknowledge the international input and to recognize that this could operate at a larger scale than just US agencies. There's a lot of effort going on elsewhere that you could draw on as well. And there are mechanisms for bringing in other countries into US funding landscape, and certainly be nice to be involved. You have a huge critical mass here. And, maybe you haven't organized yourselves yet, but I think it would be nice to have this more international than I have heard, and mostly in this meeting.
This is a comment perhaps to Mike. I wonder if, Mike, were you involved in the OSTP predictability project? I'm thinking more ambitiously here. I think this concept needs to be socialized. This idea needs to be socialized, and I can see how CLIVAR plays in a really important role in bringing the agencies together. But this was during, this was probably 2017 or thereabouts, that the then White House chief scientist, Kelvin Drogemeyer, who happens to be a meteorologist, a very competent one, set up a project called the Predictability Project. And it wasn't just climate predictability, it was predictability of complex systems, and it was a very broad and I thought well thought out project. It brought together all the agencies, and Mike could probably talk to it as much as I can. I was on the NOAA side. There were NASA, DOE, NSF, and all the agencies, all the scientists who came together on this topic of predictability. I'm thinking here whether one might want to think even bigger, not to say one short circuits this CLIVAR process, but that if one has in mind reaching OSTP levels where this then sort of gains the scale of a national, with due respect to our European colleagues, I'm thinking more of the US process. This becomes a project of national stature. Of course, you may ask what happened to the predictability project, and as soon as that administration left the White House, it just fizzled, I think. I mean, we had a document, but it never, I don't know how far it went, so maybe Mike can say a little more about that.
A couple distinctions. So that one did focus on predictability, not projections. Right? So it was different, but it was this paradigm of, the framework. And so it hasn't gone away. It has influenced some of the things that have come since. We now have a global WCRP lighthouse activity on global precipitation of the global precipitation experiment. So I could draw a line between that effort that emerged out of the US discussions of predictability that then got agencies together to think more broadly about precipitation predictability. Specifically, that then led to bringing that to the international stage that now is still being mapped out, that we have in the next decade this focus on improving the prediction of precipitation in our global models. So that's a direct one. We also have now in US CLIVAR an air-sea transition zone focused on the coupled ocean-atmosphere boundary layer that also can trace its lineage back to that predictability effort. So it was probably it was something that could pivot agencies in their working together to push new initiatives. I don't know that we're checking back in to see how well we're doing on predictability, and I think that points to that in the CPT evaluation. I think that points to when we develop these frameworks, like you're presenting here, that we come back periodically and evaluate the difference that the framework is making and how well we're doing in our implementation and where we may need new approaches for the agencies to support.
Yeah, thanks. Thanks also Ken and Graham for these excellent comments. And I think this has been also a theme that keeps coming up this week, and that while we were putting together these slides as the SOC, we tried to kind of also highlight, and I agree this is a separate thing from the climate process team type of structure, that it seems that there's a real need for some kind of way for us to work together across the agencies, specifically focusing on this problem. And we thought perhaps maybe one effort more focusing on the CPE kind of framework across multiple modeling centers and one more on climate observational uncertainty. And it seems there may be, so one question is what kind of, well, I guess maybe one question is if people have feedback about whether they think that's a good idea or not. And then another one is what mechanisms are there that can support that kind of working together? And Anne has some thoughts on this as well.
Yeah, I just want to comment and invite comments on the model that was provided in JUX through the GCSS and GAS programs, subsequent GAS programs that many of us were involved in, as well as GDAP, which was more on the observation side. Now they're a little bit different. They were working more on process modeling and LES and LES SCM work. For many years, though, these were almost unfunded efforts, essentially very weak funding, but very open community involvement. And I think what they adopted that was really key is a way to work the flowchart that became relatively inexpensive. We could kind of turn the crank over many field campaign experiments. And what the community did is offer kind of feedback, buy-in, and experience, shared experience as new projects came in. And those projects were, you know, we didn't fund the funding came from a variety of sources. The data came from a variety of sources. And so it didn't require us to have a lot of program managers pointed in the same direction necessarily all at once exactly, but there was just this very effective way to work the flow chart in a very open, grassroots, community-oriented way. So I think that would be my hope for something like this. For instance, our experience at GIS with the first Climate OSCE effort was that it was really low overhead to do a very simple climate OSCE if you already have a CPE of your model. So this gives us an idea where we could have inexpensive MIPS, essentially, that could be used to evaluate many different proposals that are coming from many different directions. And furthermore, maybe support future funding efforts by evidence that the sort of work being proposed would be impactful. At a community evaluation level. So feedback welcomed on that. That's just my perspective. I sit on the GAS panel now. I know there's folks here who are also on GDAP.
Okay, Christina McCluskey in CART. I do actually want to provide some feedback and push back a little bit on this idea of having two separate working groups. I think that there is an unlocked, I think what's missing from this is the knowledge gained by having observationalists and modelers working in the same group. I don't think that this is a two-group problem. I think it's a single-group problem, and that organizing working groups around focus areas is a more effective use of all of the tools and all of the scientists, whether you're observationalist or modeler. We're all scientists, and we're all scientists thinking about the same process system. And so I think having working groups that are organized around that is a more useful approach, as we've discussed this week. So I just want to push back on having two, and I think it's also going to be an easier sell to get a massive amount of investment. And so I just want to point that as a comment, I guess. And then I do want to mention something that hasn't been talked much about this week, which is the workforce. I think that there is something to be said about having a national level investment, and that including how to develop and sustain a workforce to tackle this problem. And I think that's where you can do this cost-benefit analysis of the cost of not generating this workforce, not generating jobs and longer-term employment for our early career scientists, which is a major challenge right now in our community with the bleed of scientists going to the private sector. And so I just want to highlight that as a component of this is how are we investing in the future workforce to address this problem? Thank you.
I feel those are both excellent points. Thank you, Christina. And I saw a lot of heads nodding about the workforce concerns.
And actually, I really agree from the gas GDAP perspective. There's been they develop different thrusts and then they don't work together as effectively as they could. And maybe we should really consider that as a revision. And if so, I think it would be the top working group that really encompasses it all.
Marcus Vandler, Walke, Columbia University. Just a little thing on the reducing uncertainty. I think that it seems like there's broad consensus that maybe that can be refined to constraining uncertainty or reducing and quantifying uncertainty. That's just a minor nitpick.
Yeah, I wrote that bullet point. The reason I put reducing is because I've observed that people often don't use constrain in its technical sense. They use it to mean something other than what I and Ken Carslow, I think, both understand it to mean, which is really, but yeah, we can certainly, yeah, it is a good point. That would be more precise.
One thing I don't think I've heard much discussion about during this meeting is how we propagate uncertainty through the models, right? Like, I don't think uncertainty is actually very well quantified, like the uncertainty from, structural error in the aerosol, for example. I'm not aware of anybody that has a clean pipeline for doing that. And that seems like an important, I feel like we actually don't have a handle on the uncertainty because we're not able to do this. So anyways, just to raise that point as something that maybe is missing.
Okay, yeah. I also want to point out how not heard much about how we're going to deliver the uncertainty of the data, climate data, to the users, the practitioners. This is because in DOE we have this facet project, and we work with stakeholders, and the key issues raised from there is that they don't know how to appropriately use those data, and of course there's also scale mismatch, between what we produced and what they need, and besides that, they also don't know how, what's the uncertainty they should use in their model to estimate the risks of the mitigation strategies. But I'm not sure this is within the scope
well,
of
it is one of the key takeaways that we had, just the idea that you do need to deal with the observational uncertainty because ultimately that's how you improve the models and reduce the projection uncertainty. I don't know if maybe Kaitlyn or Greg want to say a few words on the results from the breakout, because we did discuss these exact problems, and so those are we are aware of those, or perhaps Anna, Susanna. But oh, this is a shoe-free zone, Greg. It's all good.
Yeah. Who would have thought? So this was about using uncertainty and propagating it through, right? Yeah.
Yeah, and how to connect modelers with the observational uncertainty. So I thought, for instance, in your talk, some great examples of that.
Yeah. Well, I would almost go back to Christina's comment about, there's been this long, built-in for quite some time, separation between observationalists and modelers. I kind of see that because I used to be and still have my feet in that camp of developing products. So I think that has to be nurtured more closely because you really can't you can't be a recipient of, well, you know, of a paper that says, well, the uncertainty is this. You can't be a recipient of just, you know, here's the document outlining what the uncertainty is. You really have to have an honest conversation with observationalists as a modeler, because sometimes things aren't fully reported. You know, sometimes we don't like to perturb algorithmic parameters that might cause our uncertainty to be 300%. So I think that there has to be more discussion, and then how do we, when there are instances of large uncertainty, how do we acknowledge that to both to all the communities and report it, right? I think that's a really important part. So I really think you have to merge. We have to force merging of observational and modeling communities.
Yeah.
Oh, I see. I got it.
Yeah, it's more about deliver communicate climate data uncertainty to the users, to the practices. That is what I mentioned, which is slightly different communicate between observation and the model uncertainty.
Chime in on that. Anna and I are just having a little side conversation about the answer to that.
I was just commenting that at GIS, I think we see the CPE as a way to at least have a quantification of the uncertainty, and you can, for, you know, whatever it is you're interested in, whether it's climatic impact drivers or what have you, because we have a spread from equally likely models, it gives us that's our, you know, one pathway forward. I was just commenting on quantification.
Yeah, and a lot of, right. Oh, sorry.
Oh, so I was just going to build on that a little bit and say, I think that once we stand up a CPE framework, one of the next phases of that should be addressed would be to add in human impacts relevant metrics, because it's not just there are certain things that, as I think you're getting to, Jiwen, that are needed for decision making that are not necessarily standard outputs from our models, but that could be generated from the models with just a little bit of additional work. So yeah, but then if you had that if you had the metrics in the model, then the CPE will give you the uncertainty in it in a more robust way. And I think that's what another thing that this kind of framework can deliver.
Jesse Loveridge, Colorado State University. So yeah, in terms of the measurement uncertainty and bringing these communities together, I guess both for the in situ probes and the remote sensing, there is lots of uncertainty quantification, but it's all in the primary literature. There's no one answer for every particular case. And so getting people in the room together is a necessary step. But I guess here we are in the room and there aren't many remote sensing people. How, like they're invited, but they're not here. So kind of getting that, I guess, pushing people together, how are you or we going to do that? And I guess this comes back to the report where you had 4 points, I think, on one of your early slides. One of them was on remote sensing. Mm-hmm. That's 1% of the workshop, 25% of your 4 points. So I'm kind of wondering how this information is going to come in and, I guess, express itself in your report, and how it will reach the right ears to kind of address this.
Yeah, so this is the great opportunity to convey the voice, from the, the remote sensing communities to the modeling people, and a great opportunity to get information and a demand from the modeling people, get a feedback to the remote sensing communities. So we collected all of your voices. Then we will work on, how we can enhance the communications between modeling communities and the remote sensing communities. Yeah, that should be the only pathway. And this was a discussions done 20 years ago, and still we are trying to fight, changing the situation.
I'm curious to hear, Masa, what you think, but when we work together in a way where we turn the crank, for instance, we're doing CPEs together, it's an opportunity for us to work directly and use that share our shared data sets with shared best practices uncertainty estimation. and then that goes into the OSCEs in a systematic way that we can develop together, I think that would be fantastic.
Come in on that as well. So there are a couple of community efforts to try and do this. So Aerocom, Aerosat are a set of annual workshops where aerosol modelers and aerosol retrieval people really come together, right? And the first half of the week tends to be modeling, and the second half of the week is mostly the satellite. But there's this overlap where we sit in the same room and we hear each other complain about our problems, and it's cathartic, and it does build those bridges. I guess ACPC is maybe the closest equivalent in cloud microphysics. I don't know, but these are very kind of the community-driven things, and maybe a concrete action could be more support for those activities that aim to directly build those bridges.
I think a couple of more sort of very concrete things that came out of the uncertainty breakout, those separate than the remote sensing breakout. So dealing with all observational uncertainty, including remote sensing, was the concept of having data bundles, because the systematic uncertainty, what's a systematic uncertainty in condensed liquid water path, right? No one's going out and counting every condensed droplet. So having data bundles, sort of like what Greg showed in his talk. There's also an existing framework for this that NCAR CGD has, where they have sort of guidance for model development, perhaps not with the full systematic uncertainty, but having that kind of suite of observational products that includes remote sensing, and just rather than having each thing be developed sort of ad hoc. So those are two things that were specifically discussed in the uncertainty section.
Wilson from University of Washington. Yeah, it occurred to me, I heard lots of like observation model discussion, and seems like, correct me if I'm wrong, seems like there is not much discussion about the reanalyzed data. So I'm wondering whether it's worth mentioning here, because basically like Micro2 data is like model results, right, including the observations through the data assimilation. So I'm not sure, like, I just want to raise the idea here. Yeah, thanks.
Ken Castler again at Leeds. Just a couple of observations. It's Micro2Macro, but I think to some extent we've jumped over all the way from micro to macro without really thinking everything in between. It's not clear to me how we integrate the different scales of our models, which tend to be fixed at sort of large eddy, regional, and then global. You know, it's really a digital thing, and I'm still grappling in my mind how we make use of what Andrew referred to again as the hierarchy. What are we going to do with that? How do we exploit it? It seems very powerful, but I think the community doesn't really often do a good job of.
Okay, yeah, Ken, I wonder, as a really great point, and actually Steve Kruger mentioned to me early that maybe we should refer to this as micro to regime to macro. And I think regime is one way that the community has grappled with that, thinking of the Sherwood paper, estimating uncertainties with different regimes, deep convection, stratocumulus, what have you, if you're talking about clouds. And then, of course, aerosols come in, and there's a clear sky regime there, I guess, that has meteorological context. So I wonder, you know, I guess I'm imagining that when you come down to process uncertainty estimation, it's helpful to think of regimes because differing processes dominate in differing regimes to differing degrees. So that's what I might advocate, and I think it was done very effectively over the years in GCSS as well.
I agree. That's another way of framing it, but I think also there are big scale breaks between large eddy, regional, and global that bring with them uncertainties in that connection. And propagation of uncertainty was brought up earlier. I don't know how we propagate the uncertainty through that framework. If uncertainty is the challenge, it's slightly different from the sort of process challenge we're used to addressing. So I think maybe you could reflect that in your thinking in the report.
I think that's a great point, and kind of the sort of order of magnitude back of the envelope estimates that had to do with, you know, encompassing a whole regime, trying to encompass that. If we can incorporate global storm resolving models and so on, make frameworks that can bring everything in over regimes, that could be very powerful. It's a problem.
I had another point, if that's okay, but that's just a plea to a little bit more focus on the process observations. I know you can't observe processes mostly, but making measurements in ways in which we can extract information about processes. And maybe it hasn't quite sunk into people how bad sometimes it is how useless state variable measurements are for model constraint. If you're measuring the aerosol amount, you can simply trade off the uncertainty in the emission and the uncertainty in the deposition. So that's the equifinality problem. So measuring state variables sometimes has zero impact, really close to zero, on the thing you're trying to constrain, the processes. So we need to, I think, as a community, push harder on how we're going to extract process information, and it's really important for the way we design field campaigns. We need to get a bit more creative in how we do that, because equifinality hasn't really come up in this meeting, but it is an absolute killer. You can have all the observations of state variables you like, and then you find almost none of the processes are individually constrained because of equifinality. So that hasn't really come up enough, I would say, and we should give it some more thought.
Oh, yeah. Well, I was going to say, I think that actually this may be what Andrew was kind of getting at when you commented that just applying emergent constraints maybe is not the way to go. We need to just select. We need to be constraining on relevant variables. Do you want to comment on that a little more? And maybe Greg also has some comments.
Yeah, and just to clarify, because I was talking with Matt Lebsock about this, and I took his question in a different way. So he's talking much more about the latter. And so the example we were talking about was looking at precipitation frequency and higher order moments of precipitation from satellites might be a way to constrain models, not trying to use top of the atmosphere fluxes or some other things. So, but I still think it's hard to think about constraining things that are emergent properties of the system rather than the state of the system. But yes, so focusing on the actual observables and things that we think matter, like precipitation processes.
But observables that are relevant to the important processes. Yeah.
I just like to add, yeah, Greg, go ahead.
Why don't you go ahead? So I'd like to say I strongly agree with what Ken said. I think it's in the diagram as the field campaigns and instrument design need to be informed by what the models say the uncertainties are. But that's a bit abstract if we don't say, we need to find observables that target specific processes. To Ken's other point about what do we do about scales, so I think one of the ways that global storm resolving models help us is, we think we probably won't be able to do many PPEs with them because they're so expensive, but we can use what we learned from the GCM PPEs, the observationally constrained GCM PPEs, to understand what the physics in a model should be doing. And then we can check whether the GSRMs are doing that. And then when we run the GSRMs that are doing that, they're synthesizing, at least from the kilometer scale to the global scale, with what we think are correct parameterizations of the smaller scales, which is very different from just running an LES ensemble and then saying this should be the physics that goes into a GCM ensemble, where you're kind of breaking yourself across that scale break. But in GSRMs, at least you're incorporating more scales simultaneously.
Yeah, so I really appreciate Ken's point that I totally agree with that. The remote sensing community is interested in providing the best estimate of the geophysical variables. And there is a clear gap between the model and the remote sensing communities. We don't evaluate the processes, right? So we had a breakout session about how to integrate the remote sensing data set into models. So hopefully we had a couple of nice ideas. I don't go too much into details, but we should initiate the discussions between modeler and the remote sensing scientist, how we can move this forward.
I want to add also on the Slido, for those of you logged on, there's been a couple of comments about improving communication between the three branches of like remote sensing, modelers, and people who do like lab work or surface level measurements. And I do surface level measurements, and every time I'm married to a modeler. And so we don't even communicate, like we both do new particle formation, like communication on how we get our data into models and what modelers can help with, where we should take measurements and how we should take measurements is really challenging. And I think bringing us into the room is a good idea because, like from an experimental perspective, it would be really nice to convey to modelers how incredibly difficult it is and logistically challenging it is to take very basic measurements. Like, you want us to go into the middle of the ocean? Yeah, that's not going to happen. You want us, like, we are constrained to very specific locations that have, like, electricity, like constant electricity, or that we can get our instruments to without bribing officials to get through customs. Like, there's a lot of logistical challenges that it would be nice to convey that. So when you're telling us where we should go, like, it would not be lost in translation. Hamish tells me all the time, just go take measurements. I'm like,
Well, we do want to, so we do have a wrap at the end of this workshop at 11:45, and want to make sure that people are getting the groom, have the chance to get it. So maybe we'll have a couple more comments. And again, if you are worried that your comment is not going to be captured by us, then please reach out to one of us or the Slido.
Just one comment. I totally very much agree with Ken, but I also feel that mean state is too conservatively defined. For instance, if I look across our ensemble, there's variations in the diurnal cycle amplitude and phase. Why could that not be a mean state variable? There's land-ocean differences indicative of convective processes. Why could the mean state of that not be incorporated into a diagnostic? There's pattern effects, so prescribed SST runs, West Pack versus East Pack, there's differences. So I consider those as potentially able to be wrapped into mean state definition that I think are indicative of processes, but I still would call them mean states because they can be formulated into climatologies.
So just to respond to that, I think somewhere between the global annual mean and the observations of what cloud droplets are doing individually is the golden, the happy mean, the Goldilocks point. And one of the powerful things about your approach, the CPE approach, is that you can just throw tons of candidate process observations at the problem and see which ones work and find the right trade-off between things that are just impossible to retrieve and things that have no information content.
Alyssa, do you have a few comments about transportation?
Not yet. I do in a second. But this is a comment from Patrick Taylor online. And it says, to the point, I hadn't heard anything on new technology development that are needed for enabling the process advances that we need. It would be good to consider new instrument investments or platform investments, such as UAVs, that could enable new process study designs. UAVs could sample us to follow clouds and sampling the evolution more directly than you could with standard aircraft.
I think that's somewhere on this flow chart. I guess it's sort of part of the climate OSCE concept, right, is that you can test hypothetical measurements, yeah.
Yeah, I think the point is when we write the report, we should make sure that's explicitly mentioned. And I do think we were certainly, like thinking back on the talks the last couple of days, new instrument development and the need for, and also in the breakout sessions, the need for new instrument development to close some of those observational gaps was a clear theme.
One more, if anyone has a burning comment / question. Johannes, take us home.
I want to complain about how emergent constraints were discussed in this meeting.
A complaint is good too. This is a good venue.
That's it.
Oh.
No, I think they're very powerful for linking the process. So if you do emergent constraints across multiple models, then you're always wondering, is this a spurious correlation? But in Klein and Hall, they say that the way to convince yourself that there's actual physical content in the emergent constraint is to do it in PPEs. And since we've been talking about PPEs all week, we should be doing that.
I want to thank Patrick for his comment and say that, in the best world, we would be using climate OSCEs and this OSCE process to motivate, future satellite measurements that are expensive, that we haven't been able to make yet, where we have the technology in hand, for instance. We have instances of that. And things that are not yet imagined, and field campaigns that have not yet occurred, and future surface-based measurement techniques. And by the way, I just want to comment that sometimes a large uncertainty, is still plenty to really deliver us measurable results, and that's what the OSCE can tell us. So I hope that working together in this integrated way would be really exciting.
All right, the road is clear apparently. So I think with that, let's wrap the sort of comments and feedback section of this. Again, we will capture these comments, any comments you send to us, things you put on the Slido, and when we write the white paper, we'll try to reflect the community sentiment. With that, just like to thank a few people who've helped a lot in the workshop. Rob and I would really like to thank the rest of the scientific organizing committee. We've done a lot of work on going through abstracts and designing breakouts and sessions. And so, yeah, thank you so much for your work on.
Thank you.
All right. Also, thanks to US CLIVAR and the Program Organizing Committee for dealing with the logistical hurdle of organizing something in Wyoming. So we're really excited to have you here, and thanks again for coming all this way north. So thanks to Alyssa, Mike, and Jessica for your work. Folks that were volunteered into being breakout and note-taking contributors, so you're really a critical part of designing this white paper. And finally, thank Adam and the rest of the NSF UW King Air team for putting together a reception on Monday. I'd like to thank Tom, Joe, Eddie, Isaac, Jake, and the rest of the UW Conference Center team that are allowing us to host in this nice space. And again, we're really excited to have you up here, sufficiently so that one of our sponsoring agencies left you all stickers that they made for this event. So please grab those on the way out. On that note, again, we'd like to thank US CLIVAR, our federal sponsors, as well as our local sponsors at the university level. So this has been a function of a lot of people contributing monetarily to making this happen. With that, yeah, thanks everyone for attending. It was really fun having you all here.
And I would just like to give Daniel a really big round of applause for leading us. Tremendous job, Daniel. Brilliant.